Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that's, well, it's often seen through a lens of mystery, maybe misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're exploring the fascinating, sometimes let's say challenging world of tantric rituals, specifically focusing on how certain practices, the ones that often get sensationalized, like historical blood offerings, have actually evolved.
Right. And our guide here, the basis for this discussion, it's insights from someone with over 2 decades immersed in these authentic traditions.
20 years.
Yeah, across India and Nepal, researching, experiencing them directly. So this is really a look from within the tradition, based on deep ground-level experience, not just academic theory.
That's so important. So our mission here is really to move past the shock value, isn't it?
Definitely.
To understand the actual historical context and uncover how these ancient traditions have adapted ethically, but crucially, while preserving their core power. We're aiming to pull out the most important nuggets, the key takeaways from the source material directly for you.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When many people think of tantric practices, that image often comes up, doesn't it?
It does.
Maybe
yeah.
something dramatic, from movies or sensational stories, dim oil lamps, intense ceremonies, maybe even something perceived as dark or shocking, like those historical offerings.
That external perception is, well, unfortunately very common. And honestly, it often misses the entire point. It's
Right.
fueled by media portrayals, superficial accounts, and it tends to sort of freeze these complex traditions in time, or paints them as static and bizarre.
Yeah.
But what our source really emphasizes is the significant evolution that's happened within the traditions themselves over centuries.
Centuries, wow.
Yeah. The true essence, the source stresses,
Yeah.
has always been about honoring life force, Prajna, not the taking of it.
Honoring life force. Okay. So to really get this, we need to look past that sensational imagery
Absolutely.
and dig into the historical context, the symbolic meaning behind these practices.
Exactly. And just to set the stage properly, it's crucial to remember something. Ritual offerings, even including animal offerings, they weren't unique to Tantra. Not at all. They were actually prevalent across many ancient cultures globally. You find parallels in Vedic practices, ancient Greek, Roman traditions, various indigenous cultures.
It was a wider phenomenon.
Very much so. And generally, they were viewed as sacred exchanges, a way of acknowledging the inherent sacrifice that kind of underpins existence, the fact that life sustains itself through other life.
Okay, so offerings as a concept are widespread. Now, narrowing back to Tantra, based on the source material, what were the specific purposes? Why these practices involving blood offerings historically? What was the thinking?
Right. Well, the source points to a few key interconnected purposes. First, blood was seen as this really potent symbol,
Right.
a representation of life force, vitality. So it was like offering something fundamental, really powerful.
Makes sense.
Second, especially in traditional agricultural societies, animals were incredibly valuable. They represented wealth, labor, sustenance.
A major resource.
Exactly. So offering an animal was a really significant sacrifice of value. And third, it was a very direct, almost visceral recognition of life's continuity, its interdependence.
That idea of life-sustaining life.
Precisely. Acknowledging that fundamental reality. But here's something particularly insightful, a real nugget from the source. Even the ancient texts themselves were pointing towards a deeper, more symbolic understanding.
Way back then.
Yes. For instance, the Kularnava Tantra, that's a 9th century Kawula text, it mentions offerings, but clarifies that the external form is, quote, merely a symbol of the internal surrender.
Internal surrender.
Yeah, referring to the sacrifice of one's own ego or limitations, ignorance.
Well, it's the idea that it's about internal sacrifice, not just the outward act. That's not some modern reinterpretation.
Not at all. It was right there in the ancient texts. It shows this wasn't just about the physical act. It was layered with symbolic meaning from very early on. And another text, the Mahanirvana Tantra, reinforces this. It states something like, those who understand the essence know that the true sacrifice is of one's own ignorance, not of other beings.
So the texts themselves provided this deeper layer.
Exactly. These passages reveal a really sophisticated understanding of sacrifice present right within the tradition's own literature centuries and centuries ago.
Okay.
Which leads us to maybe the biggest misconception the source really tackles head on.
Just
The idea that ethical alternatives to animal or blood offerings are somehow a new thing.
Right, like a modern concession, maybe.
Right.
Or a Western influence.
Exactly that. But based on decades of study, in traditional settings, the source makes it absolutely clear. Traditional lineages have been developing and using ethical alternatives for centuries.
For centuries, not just recently.
For centuries. There's historical evidence, for instance, from studies at places like Kamakya Temple, a very old, very significant site showing these alternatives were in use hundreds of years ago.
Centuries ago. That completely flips the common narrative, doesn't it? That these alternatives are just a recent thing.
It really does.
So what kind of evidence does the source offer for this ancient evolution within the tradition itself? How did that work?
Well, first there's that textual sanction we just talked about.
Okay.
But the source gets specific. It notes how texts like the Kulanaba Tantra and also the Tantraloka from the 10th century explicitly allow for substitutions.
They actually say you can substitute.
Yes. The Kulanaba says something like, where blood is mentioned, the wise practitioner may substitute red flowers. Why? Because it is the intention and life force representation that matters most.
Intention over substance.
Exactly. And the Tantraloka emphasizes that the highest offering is one's focused awareness. All external substances are merely aids to this primary sacrifice. So these aren't just workarounds, they're embedded principles in the tradition.
Wow, it's built-in adaptability.
Precisely. The core principle is the state of consciousness, the intention, the symbolic representation of life force and surrender, and the source lists specific traditional substitutes that have ancient roots and, importantly, are still used today.
Like what? What are these ancient substitutes?
Things like red hibiscus flowers, known as joba, especially significant in Kali practices. Kumkum powder, that red vermilion powder often used for auspicious marks. It represents blood, the feminine principle. Also beetroot essence. And Rakta Chandana, which is a red sandalwood paste often used in rituals.
Fascinating.
And even symbolic mudras, hand gestures, are mentioned as valid substitutions.
So these aren't modern inventions at all. They're part of the historical toolkit.
Absolutely. And the source quotes an elderly tantric at Terapith, another major site, saying something really powerful about this.
What did he say?
He said, even centuries ago, practitioners who could not or would not use blood had these alternatives. This isn't new. What matters is the consciousness behind the offering, not the substance itself.
The consciousness behind the offering, not the substance itself. That just crystallizes it, doesn't it?
It really does. The adaptability is inherent because the practitioners understood the underlying awareness, the intention. That was the true core, more important than the exact physical stuff being used.
Okay, but this raises a really fundamental question then. If you can substitute the physical substance, how can something like, say, a flower or a powder or even a gesture possibly carry the same ritual power? How does it tap into the same principles as something historically seen as potent as blood?
Right, that's the key question. And the answer lies in understanding the underlying principles the rituals are designed to tap into. The source details this. First, there's still that core acknowledgement of life's interdependence. The alternatives maintain this ritual recognition that life sustains itself through other life, just in a non-violent form. The principle holds.
So the core message is still there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, the ultimate goal isn't really the offering itself. It's about connecting to the primal life force, that vital energy flowing through everything.
The prajna you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. There's a great quote in the source from a Kahula teacher about this. He says, the goal is to awaken awareness of the life current flowing through all existence.
Okay.
This awareness can be accessed through many doorways. The substance matters less than the consciousness it evokes.
Many doorways. I like that. It really reframes how we think about ritual tools, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And third, these practices aim to overcome separation. That feeling of being disconnected from the fundamental realities of existence, birth, death, interdependence. They use powerful symbols to help facilitate direct experience, something that goes beyond just intellectual understanding. As one Bengali tantric observed, modern people are often disconnected from these basic realities.
Oh.
And while the practices help reconnect us, the reconnection can happen through many means if the intention is properly directed.
So it's less about the exact physical thing and much more about the principle it represents and the consciousness it helps evoke.
You got it.
Connecting you, the practitioner, to these deeper truths. That makes perfect sense now, how alternatives can be just as potent.
Exactly. And building on those very principles, the traditional lineages that the source author studied, they continue to teach and practice numerous alternatives today. alternatives that maintain that ritual power while being fully aligned with contemporary ethical values.
Okay, so let's look at those specific modern practices that draw from these ancient principles. The source describes self-offering practices. What does that involve?
Yeah, these are really powerful because they shift the focus entirely inward. They represent the sacrifice of the self, which, as we saw, even the ancient texts pointed towards.
Right, the internal surrender.
Exactly. So symbolically, this can involve a tiny, safely drawn amount of one's own blood offered with proper intention, but much more commonly it's symbolized by applying red sandalwood paste, Rakta Chandana, to energy centers, like the forehead or the heart.
Okay.
And crucially, it also involves the symbolic offering of ego attachments, limitations, negative patterns, maybe writing them down and then ritually dissolving or burning them, that kind of thing.
That's profound.
It is. And the source shares a particularly moving quote about this from a teacher and therapist.
Oh, yeah.
He said, "The most powerful offering has always been one's own limitations, not external substances. Offering a drop of your own blood with proper intention carries infinitely more power than any animal sacrifice performed mechanically."
Wow. That completely reframes the concept of sacrifice, doesn't it? From an external act upon something else to a deep internal transformation.
Totally transforms it.
And then there are the plant-based alternatives. We know they have ancient roots, but how are they actually used and understood today?
Oh, they're absolutely central still. Red hibiscus, extremely important, especially in Kali practices, often prepared and offered with specific mantras.
Okay.
Rakta Chandana, that red sandalwood paste, is widely used. Beetroot essence is prepared ritually, sometimes mixed with water or milk. And traditional red powders like kumkum and sindoor are definitely utilized.
So they're actively used in practice.
Very much so. The source actually observes senior priestesses preparing these plant-based substances with specific visualizations and mantras. The understanding is that this process activates the same energetic signature as the older, more literal forms of offering.
Activating the same energetic signature. Interesting.
Yeah. And then for practitioners who are more developed, the source describes the use of visualization and energy work.
Without physical substances at all.
Exactly. This can be incredibly advanced. It might involve visualizing the dissolution of one's limited identity or using sophisticated breath practices, pranayama, and mantras to activate internal energy centers. The idea is to achieve the same energetic effects, the same connection to life force, but entirely internally, without needing any external physical substance as a focus.
So it's like progressing inward.
Right. A teacher in Uttarakhand summed this up really well. He said, "The external is merely a training wheel for the internal. As consciousness develops, external supports become less necessary."
Training wheels for the internal. That's a great analogy. So the tradition isn't just offering alternatives like a menu. It's actually outlining a kind of sophisticated path, moving from external support towards internal mastery.
That's a perfect way to put it.
All aimed at the same core spiritual goal. It really paints a picture of an evolving, living system.
Precisely. And that gets back to the core idea from the source material. Authentic traditions demonstrate their power, their vitality, through adaptation, not in spite of it.
So it's not dilution.
No, it's evolution. It shows the tradition is alive, relevant, capable of meeting practitioners where they are, ethically and spiritually.
The source shares a wonderful little anecdote about this, doesn't it?
Right.
About meeting an elderly tantric.
Oh yeah, in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
This practitioner used only plant offerings.
Right. And when asked why.
His response was just incredibly insightful. He said, "The goddess cares about your consciousness, not your substances. Those who insist otherwise understand neither the goddess nor the tradition."
Boom. That really highlights the internal wisdom that seems to guide this evolution, doesn't it?
It does. It shows that the true measure of authenticity from within the tradition itself lies in preserving the essence, the core principles, not in rigidly clinging to forms that may have become outdated or ethically problematic for some, and assuming these traditions must be static, that they haven't evolved internally. Well, ironically, that can be a kind of limited perspective itself. It doesn't acknowledge their inherent sophistication, their adaptive capacity.
That's a really important nuance, especially when we look at ancient practices from our modern viewpoint. Okay, so thinking about someone listening now, maybe someone curious about these paths today, what does the source tell us about engaging ethically, respectfully? What are the key takeaways for you, the listener?
Yeah, the source offers some really crucial guidance here. First, Respect the living tradition. Understand that it has its own internal history, its own evolution, driven by wisdom from within. What might look like modernization often has really deep roots.
Okay, respect its history of change.
Second, seek authentic guidance. Be discerning about teachers. Look for those connected to genuine lineages, people who understand both the core essence and the necessary ethical adaptations. Steer clear of the purely sensationalized versions.
Find knowledgeable guides. Got it.
Third, honor the spirit, not the letter. Remember those quotes we discussed. The form is a means to an end. Don't get fixated on just the external appearances. Focus on the inner transformation the practices are actually aiming for.
Focus on the why.
Exactly. And fourth, recognize cultural context without appropriation. These aren't practices for shock value or for performance. They address profound existential questions: life, death, consciousness. Approach them with seriousness, with deep respect for their origins and their profound aims.
That sounds like incredibly valuable advice for anyone looking to approach these complex spiritual areas with genuine respect and understanding.
It really is. And perhaps the most maybe empowering takeaway from the source is this idea that the tradition's evolution helps us move beyond binary thinking, beyond either-or.
How so? What kind of either choices does it help us transcend?
Well, it shows you don't necessarily have to choose between things that might seem opposed. Like, you don't have to choose between authentic tradition or ethical practice.
Okay.
You don't have to choose between ancient wisdom or modern values.
Right.
And you don't have to choose between powerful ritual or compassionate action.
They can coexist.
Exactly. The living tradition itself, as explored in the source material, demonstrates how these can be integrated, how spiritual practice can remain both deeply potent and relevant across time and changing contexts.
This deep dive has really helped unpack how these traditional tantric practices, the ones often clouded by sensationalism, actually have this rich internal history of ethical evolution, maintaining their core principles and power precisely through adaptation, not by resisting it.
And it's worth repeating, this whole exploration is grounded in that deep experience and expensive research shared by Dr. Deepak Subedi, insights from his 2 decades of study and his forthcoming work as well.
It really does give you a whole new perspective on how powerful traditions manage to stay alive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
By changing the form while holding tight to the core meaning.
It does. And maybe if there's one thought for you to take away from this deep dive, perhaps it's the wisdom the source leaves us with at the end.
What's that?
The wise adapt the form while preserving the essence. Only the foolish cling to forms while losing their meaning.
Wow. The wise adapt the form while preserving the essence. That's a powerful thought, isn't it?
It really is.
Not just for understanding ritual, maybe, but for navigating change and holding on to what truly matters in our own lives, more broadly, perhaps.
Could be applied much more widely, yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the evolution of tantric ritual. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.